I'm Linda Hirsch.
I'm Jim Carney, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education.
Has public school teaching become the most controversial profession in America? Politicians, the media, and even parents are showing their displeasure with education by pointing to teachers as the culprits for poor student performance.
Why this focus on teachers? Will firing teachers, removing tenure, and weakening unions help students learn to read or do math?
My guest today, Dana Goldstein, has written a deeply researched and balanced book about what she calls the teacher wars. She joins me to discuss what the past can teach us about education today and the lessons we can apply moving forward. My guest today is Dana Goldstein, journalist and author of The Teacher Wars, a history of America's most embattled profession. A nuanced and rich look at teaching in America, the book has received wide praise. The LA Review of Books calls it a book that ought to be read by all American teachers and read twice by anyone who presumes to advise them. Thank you so much for joining us on EdCast today.
Thank you, Linda.
Your book is a comprehensive study of 200 years of the history of teaching in the United States. It talks about the wars being waged against teachers, and it also talks about the battles that teachers themselves have waged. What got you interested in this?
Well, I was covering education for a small magazine called The American Prospect, and I was also covering the 2008 Democratic presidential primary. Now, if you think back, that was the race between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. So I was struggling to figure out what really differentiated them from a policy perspective. And one of the things that emerged in that fight between them was education. That year, President Obama was booed in front of a teachers union audience for supporting merit pay tied to student test scores. So I really started to see that there was sort of a melee going on in American politics over teaching. It wasn't really a right-left, Democratic, Republican, traditional type of divide. And as a journalist, that excited me and made me very curious because there's not that many issues in American politics that are nuanced in the way that education is, and that continue to surprise you. And also, I'm the daughter and granddaughter of public school teachers, stepdaughter of a New York City public school teacher. So I went to public schools. Education is in my family, it's in my blood, it's an interest of mine, and I really felt like to understand this system and why we're fighting today, you did need to look back at history, and I was surprised. I was looking for a book like this that I could pick up, read as a journalist, and come away with an understanding of the past, and that's why I wanted to write this book.
I thought what's really interesting, of course, in your book is that you point out that many of the issues that we're confronting today have their genesis in the history of the profession going back to the beginning. So let's, if you wouldn't mind walking us through some of the key moments in time that you think have really had the biggest influence. So let's go back to the 19th century.
Sure.
Tell us about what you know about what happened then and what we're looking at now as a result.
So until the 1830s, we really didn't have in any state in the United States a public school system as we think of it today. And what happened in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s was the flowering of a movement called the Common Schools movement. And a lot of people have heard of Horace Mann and know him as the father of public education, the father of our public school system. He was the first state secretary of education, and he served that role in Massachusetts. And what the Common Schools reformers did in that first half of the 19th century is they made the argument that education ought to be funded by the state, and importantly also that it ought to be compulsory, so parents don't have a choice, but they have to send their kids to school even if they would rather have them working at
as
home.
labor, right?
Yeah,
Yep.
so it was really establishing the right to say what we might consider today a K through 6 or K through 7 type of education, and in order to do that, it was going to be quite expensive, and the idea that we don't want to raise taxes is perennial in American history. It existed back then, of course. And so one of the big concerns was how we would pay for these common schools. And that's what where I begin my book is the story of how teaching became a female profession in America. because it really dates to the fact that the Common Schools reformers understood that they could pay women 50% as much as men. So if they were going to guarantee the right to a public education, it made sense from their perspective to kind of recast the teaching profession as one that women would do, which actually was not the case previously to that.
So we have that idea, then we put women in here. You also mentioned the way that teaching was envisioned as a kind of missionary work. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that also has direct bearing on how we feel about teachers today.
Yeah, so back in the 19th century when people were debating what should American public education be, they looked quite closely at France and Germany and other nations that were also establishing public schools at that time. One thing that made American public education different is that the job of the schools was conceived more as a moral mission to create moral, upright, even Protestant Christian type of citizens. And this was more important than intellectual knowledge. So in that way, our system was very different from, say, the French public education system, which was much more interested in this liberal arts curriculum and making sure that teachers were able to impart that at a high level of intellectualism. So the idea that women should be teachers went hand in hand with the idea that schools are places to teach children morality, because in that 19th century conception, women were more pure. They were almost biologically suited because of their role as mothers to spend their day with kids.
Lots of echoes here. And of course, so this legacy that we have today is, of course, the feminization of the teaching profession, the lower pay for women, a kind of cheap labor kind of argument, and of course, the moral imperative of being a teacher, which I think is very interesting. I think it echoes today. So let's move forward a little bit when suddenly women are told they're not tough enough. When does this happen?
So between 1800 and 1900, we go from a profession that's 90% male to one that's about 75% female. Today, teaching is 76% female, so not a lot has changed. But by the early 20th century, education reformers at that time started to doubt what the previous generation, the Horace Manns, had done. They started to become very concerned that women were not up to be good teachers. And one of the things they were worried about was the massive number of immigrant children that were flooding into urban schools at that time from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Italian and Irish children, and they didn't maybe come from families that were like the families that were already here. And there was the concern that female teachers were not tough enough to deal with the behavior problems that these low-income immigrant children would have, and a new generation of attacks on women teachers.
Now you mentioned, of course, the unionization of the teaching profession, and you highlight the role that women really played in this. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the modern teachers union movement dates back to 1897, and it's a direct outgrowth of what we were just talking about, attacks on women of not being good enough teachers. And a lot of people don't realize that the teachers union movement was explicitly a feminist movement.
I didn't know that. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, the early teachers union organizers and the movement really began in Chicago. People like Margaret Haley, who's a big character in my book. They were also very active in women's suffrage, in battles for equal pay for women. Teachers at that time made as much as, say, a house servant in a wealthy family's home would make. And when teachers made the argument that their work was perhaps worth more than a cleaning woman, they were told to be happy that they made something similar to what other women made in these other types of jobs. So women couldn't vote, so they needed to unionize so that they could ally themselves with male organized labor. Even though the male workers were blue collar and the female workers were often more educated, but the male workers could vote and they were able to lobby politically very effectively. So it made sense for these female teachers who were explicitly feminists to partner with the labor movement.
So as we move forward into what you refer to as the civil rights era, you point out some dangerous and disturbing things that happened then. Tell us a little about how that affected black teachers in particular and what happened there.
One of the big pieces of history that certainly professional historians know about and we don't often talk about in our contemporary debate is that when the schools integrated, and here I'm explicitly speaking about Southern schools, because the courts never actually did a full and complete job or any job at all really, of integrating northern schools.
A legacy to lots of things still. Okay.
Yeah, but when the southern schools integrated, two schools, one had been historically white and one had been historically black, would have some cross-fertilization of their student bodies, and teacher jobs and principal jobs would be lost in this process because you didn't need to have these two totally separate systems. And tens of thousands of black educators, teachers and principals lost their jobs. And it was explicitly discriminatory. There were efforts on the part of white school boards and State Department of Education in the South to make sure that it was only black educators who lost their jobs in this integration process. So this is a very painful part of American education history that certainly the black community is aware of, but it often doesn't get discussed today. And I think that it undergirds some of the cynicism that communities of color sometimes feel with things like school closures. Now, today we have school closures for a totally different set of reasons than we did back in the 60s and 70s when schools were integrating. But the effects can sometimes be the same, which is that veteran teachers of color are losing their jobs.
You also told recounted some disturbing incidents, I believe that happened post-slavery, or times when black students were doing really, really well, working in schools with high academic standards and learning a tremendous amount, and then those schools were dismantled, shut down, and I thought all of that was painfully interesting. I mean,
I really looked at Washington, D.C. because there's a very famous high school there, the M Street High School, and that school was all about sending black students to elite colleges. But consistently there were attacks from the white and sometimes from certain members of the black elite as well, like Booker T. Washington, to make
the vocational push versus academic.
To make the teachers in that school switch and stop teaching a liberal arts curriculum and instead teach a vocational curriculum to these black students. And it was very difficult for the black teachers who wanted to teach the liberal arts curriculum to withstand this political pressure to stop.
Now, as we move into more contemporary history in the United States and we look at some of the political unrest that occurred in the United States with Black Power, how did that affect the teachers? And I think that also has a strong reverberation today.
Yeah,
what happened?
Beginning in about 1966 with the rise of the Black Power movement, that coincided with the sense of disappointment in communities of color, especially in the North, that integration was not happening fast enough and in many cases was not happening at all. So for example, here in New York City, we had a lot of commissions and people having conversations about how to integrate schools. And some group of students were being bused. Usually it were the black and Latino children that were being bused to the white schools. And then when they got there, they were not welcomed. And so people started to feel quite cynical about integration, which I would argue that this was examples of integration that was done very poorly, and we know now how to do a better job. But the Black Power movement rose partly in response to that, and they said, look, we're not going to be welcomed by white educators, by white families. Let's stop pushing on integration and instead have community control of our schools. And for the activists that were involved in that movement, most infamously here in New York City, in Brooklyn, also in Harlem, there was a movement on the Lower East Side. They said they wanted parents to be very involved with selecting the principals and teachers for their kids' school, regardless of tenure protections. And this, of course, ignited the very famous New York City teacher strike, the largest teacher strike in American history, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and the showdown really between the community control movement and Al Shanker's United Federation of Teachers.
And you do a really great job in telling that story of how these teachers really were now seen as the enemy. In some ways, they really were running counter to what these parent local control groups wanted. And so this idea of tenure comes into play here. And I thought the explanation of why teachers wanted tenure. Let's talk about the genesis and if you still think tenure is important today.
Yeah, tenure dates back before collective bargaining. So teachers in large numbers got collective bargaining in the 60s, but tenure existed way before that.
How early?
I think about 1912. You'll have to look.
That's much earlier than I would have thought.
Yeah, and the reason why tenure was popular is because both reformers, accountability reformers of the early 20th century and teachers, they agreed that tenure was a good idea. They looked over at the Prussian, the German education system, and they saw that teaching was a much more respectable prestigious occupation in Germany, and one of the things that German teachers had was tenure. They also had pensions. So this began the push to bring these things to the United States, with the idea that if teachers weren't constantly worried about losing their jobs because of budget cuts, and also if mayors and school boards were prevented from using teaching jobs as a form of patronage. So the alderman's sister-in-law is going to get the job.
Right, and if you're pregnant,
Right.
you are let go.
Right. So that's really where tenure comes from. New Jersey was the first state to have a statewide law.
I bet Governor Christie would like to undo that law immediately.
Yeah, he sure would. He has tried.
Yes, I know.
So it's a very old policy, and there weren't really for many decades many problems that people had with it. Sometimes people would kind of wonder if this left bad teachers in the classroom, and sometimes it did.
Do you think we need that protection today?
You know, I struggled. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, because I had an internal struggle with this question. And after researching the history of teaching and including the reporting I've done as a journalist with teachers currently in the classroom, I do think we need tenure for teachers. It's such a politicized job, and teachers are so often punished if they critique the education policies of the administrations that they're working for, that I do think we need this protection. But I do think the tenure system needs to change. It's much too long of a process to remove a bad teacher. And there's a lot that can be done to streamline this process. Give a person a year or two to improve, and then it must be within a matter of weeks that you can resolve these types of disputes.
So the view we have of teachers today at its most negative is that they're not very effective, they're not too bright, and they are being protected and cosseted by unions and tenure. What do you say to that view of teachers today?
I think it's a very stereotypical, limited, and most times false view. I mean, I think even if you look at some of the toughest accountability hawks who are out there making arguments against the teaching profession, one of them is Eric Hanushek, the Hoover Institution economist. You know, even he would say American teachers are some of the best teachers in the world. I asked people all across the country who are in favor of these tough accountability measures for teachers, how many teachers do you think are not up to par and need to be pushed out of the profession? And I would get estimates from anywhere from 2% to on the upper end 15%. So if you're talking about a profession where maybe 2% or 5%, maybe 15% of people are not really doing their job very well, that's not very different than any other profession.
Not to mention, as you point out, how many teachers there are.
Yeah.
If I look at the law profession, or you point out medical profession, there are so far fewer people.
That's right.
So
yeah, there's 5 times
people.
as many teachers as doctors or lawyers. So.
When I read your book, I had that feeling of everything old is new again, and you recount in detail how some of the ideas that we champion today have already been tried and they have already failed. Which things in particular?
Well, any educator and many parents watching today will have heard of value-added measurement, which is the strategy that's been presented as very innovative, in which student test scores are used to judge teachers. This actually existed back in the 1920s and 30s. Back then they called it the pupil change method. So this was one of the moments where I was sitting in the library quietly by myself, researching the history of the profession, and I wanted to jump up and shout what I had discovered, because this is something that, you know, since the 1990s we've been told is totally new. In fact, it did exist back then, and they did social scientists did all kinds of studies to see if it was accurate. And they found that there was a difference between the typical teacher and the best teacher of about 3 percentage points on a 100-point test for a student. But they eventually decided it wasn't that promising of a technique. So many other factors could affect a student's test score. The differences between the best and worst teachers were pretty small, and teachers didn't love this technique, and it didn't give teachers a good sense of why they were maybe underperforming and what they could do better. So the critiques are the same. The technique is the same.
How about merit pay?
Merit pay has existed for a very long time. It's typically short-lived. So, you know, again,
we hear about it all the time today.
Yeah, people were very interested in it in the 1920s, and the 1950s, and the 80s. Again, today, it tends to come to the fore in eras where big business is being looked to as an idea generator for our public schools. The truth is the teaching profession is different than many other professions in that it is explicitly collaborative, and if you interview teachers about how they like to work, they don't feel competitive but actually collaborative with their colleagues. And so merit pay, depending on how it's instituted, can undermine that. But even where whole schools have tried merit pay in a collaborative sense, so you and I would both get the bonus if the school does well, it doesn't really seem, there's no study that shows that improves student performance.
So let's look forward now, and that is preparing teachers. And if you're saying, you know, a teacher may not have the biggest effect. There's so many other things, and I guess I do want to ask you that. Can good teachers trump all the social ills that students come to school with today?
No, teachers cannot trump poverty, but they can do their part to close gaps. And I think it's really important to not be overly cynical about that. I mean, sometimes I hear the argument like, let's not look to teachers at all when it comes to inequality. And I understand why people say that, because we could make bigger strides by raising the minimum wage, and so many other policies are more obvious places to start.
But where should we be looking now at teacher education? We've had the fast track models, the Teach for America, the New York City Teaching Fellows, where people are thrown in the classroom after a couple of weeks. Harvard just announced that they are going to be planning a whole new teacher education school or program. What do you see as the direction we should be heading if we want to prepare the best teachers?
I think we should look at what our international peers are doing, because they have not embraced this sense of a fast track. And even here in the United States, as I report in the book, Teach for America has started to question their own fast track and wondering if they should be giving people a longer on-ramp into the classroom. So if you look at a country like Finland, if you look at Singapore, parts of China, South Korea, they are really using more of an apprenticeship model to get people ready to teach. So it's a combination of the academic experience that the teacher has to have, combining educational pedagogical coursework with a strong emphasis in the subject matter that they're going to teach. So in many countries, if you're going to teach math, it's exactly the same undergraduate sequence as a math major who's going to go on to get a PhD. We need to do better there, and we need to have this apprenticeship aspect. That means that you're spending not maybe a couple weeks in a student-teacher experience, but something more like a full year doing that.
Did it disturb you in doing this book to see again the influence or the impact that corporate business people want to have in education, and why do you think they're so drawn to it?
Yeah, I mean, corporate business people have been
I'm not calling up the hedge funds every day and telling them what to do. I mean,
right. Yeah, that's a fair point. Business people have been interested in influencing our education system since the 19th century. You know, before we had Bill Gates and his ideas, we had Andrew Carnegie and all his ideas. And I go into some of this in detail in the book, especially during the 20s, which was such a boom era in our economy, and a time when schools were supposed to imitate businesses, and it didn't always work out the way it was meant to. I mean, I think if you look at why Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates today are interested in education, it appeals to their sense of self. They see themselves as people who were able to achieve success and excellence in part through the education they received. So this idea that education is the fuel of meritocracy and that it's a very good way to close inequality gaps, and you maybe don't need to look at you don't need to look as closely at structural issues like the tax code or the minimum wage. It appeals to people who find that in their own story, and I don't think their intentions are bad.
And we listen to them because, as they say in Fiddler on the Roof, when you're rich, they think you really know. So one last thought, can we end the teacher wars, and what will it take?
I've been encouraged. When I started the book in 2010, 2011, I think the wars were a lot nastier and more virulent than they are today. I feel that we're in the midst of a national conversation to question this incredibly, almost insane emphasis on standardized testing that has overtaken our whole education system since about 2001. So that is very refreshing. I also think we're talking more seriously about poverty and inequality. So this deeper, more holistic understanding can help end the teacher wars.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This was, to me, just a really rich conversation.
My pleasure.
And your book was terrific.
Thank
Dana
you.
Goldstein, author of The Teacher Awards. Thank you for joining us today on EdCast. Don't go away. We'll be back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites.
Are you a math person? Whether you answered yes or no, the latest research says there is no such thing. It's how you think about your math capabilities that correlates with how well you do. Stanford math education professor Joe Bowler asserts that students' attitudes about their capabilities may be a top obstacle to learning math. Neuroscience research shows a strong connection between the attitudes and beliefs students have about themselves and their academic outcomes. To improve math performance, Bowler is promoting new ways of implementing growth mindset programs in the classroom. It turns out, she says, that there's no such thing as a math brain.
Among the many pros and cons of the Common Core comes a new concern for students who are shy. Introverted students may be at a disadvantage under the Common Core because the standards emphasize collaboration and communication. Introverted students, unlike extroverts, may prefer not to openly participate in class discussions. To ensure that they are not ignored, educators are being encouraged to value both group work and quiet individual study time.
Research released by Gallup and Google indicates that television and film are still portraying most computer scientists as white or Asian. Gender biases already exist, with male students more likely than female students to see themselves in the field. There is also the perception that only smart people can do computer science. Many students do not feel confident enough to learn it, especially Hispanic students and girls.
Selecting the college that's best for students is a confusing process. How to sort through all the options and know what's the best fit? Technology to the rescue. eCampus News reports on the work of a Washington, D.C.-based company named Vibe Effect, which has developed an algorithm to enable students to select the college or university where they will flourish. The algorithm seeks to improve student graduation rates and matches personal traits and variables linked to success with college environments. The company is currently piloting its methods, and CEO Elena Maria Cox says that the use of algorithms and scientific modeling will benefit both students and universities.
That's great. So now in the future, the discount card at the supermarket will determine where I should go for my degree. All that data.
If it doesn't already.
It probably does. You're right. Well, that does it for this edition of EdCast.
Till next time, class dismissed.